Hello everyone and welcome to the tiebreak of the FIDE Grand Prix in Berlin. In this match we will see who Hikaru will face in the semifinals of the FIDE Grand Prix in Berlin on his quest to the candidates tournament. So in Pool B, Richard Rapport and Radoslav Wojtaszek finished on the same score, both on 3.5 out of 6, so they had to play a tiebreak today to determine who would move on. So Wojtaszek in the first game opened up with 1d4, and Richard, instead of playing solid, which is what we usually see in these types of matches, he plays more of a King's Indian. So d6, knight f3, knight f6, c4, g6, g3, white going for a fianchetto setup, bishop g7, bishop g2, castles, castles, c6, knight c3, and Richard went for the unorthodox queen to b6. Now white played h3, making sure black never has any bishop g4 shenanigans, and black played queen a6, hitting the pawn on c4. So Radoslav played b3 to protect the pawn, and black played b5. Now it's not easy to deal with this tension over here. White can trade on b5, but black should generally be quite fine here. The bishop can come out of b7, the knight comes out of d7, and black generally has quite a comfortable game here. So Wojtaszek played knight at d2, opening up his bishop on the diagonal, and after takes he recaptured with the knight. Now Richie played bishop b7, bishop b2. Both sides are just slowly improving their pieces. Knight bd7 and e4 by Wojtaszek in the center. Rook fd8, queen c2, and here Richie goes for quite an interesting idea. He goes d5, hitting the knight and creating some tension in the center. So Wojtaszek goes knight e5, but after takes, knight takes, it feels like white should be a tiny bit better. Alright, so takes, bishop takes. Now he has some pressure on this diagonal. So what does Richie do? He goes rook ac8, preparing to move c5. And it feels like, okay, if black can get in c5, he should be doing completely fine. So probably Wojtaszek should have played rook ac1 here to stop the move c5. It looks like with the move rook ac1 you're hanging a pawn, but guess what? If you take this pawn after rook a1, the queen is trapped. So you cannot take this pawn. So he played rook f1, but this allows black to go c5. And this should practically solve all of black's problems. So Wojtaszek traded the bishops, he traded the knights. And actually here black missed a little tactic. He could have played c takes d4 in between because you hit the queen. White has to move knight c5 to block and hit the queen, but magically it all works out. You go queen to b6. This pin is still quite nasty. And after rook ac1, black has d3. And don't ask me how, but somehow all of these tactics work out for black, and black would have gotten an advantage. But instead of that, Richie just recaptured. And here the position should have been approximately even. Wojtaszek should have just traded on c5. Probably black takes on b2 and takes on c5. Do not take on d1 first, because after takes, rook takes c5, you get checkmated, because the queen covers this square. But after rook takes c5, I mean both sides have 2 rooks, a queen, and 5 pawns. It should end in a draw. But Wojtaszek played the move rook ac1, and actually this was already a mistake. Here Richie had a very strong move, bishop h6, hitting the rook, and white doesn't have a good response. Because if you move the rook out of the way, now black can take, because white is no longer attacking this rook on c8 twice. And white has to move f4, but this quite drastically weakens the white king. So you don't want to do that either. Like black just moves back, has a pretty similar position to what we saw before, but it's just a little bit better because the white king is weakened. Alright, but Richie comes up with another good move. He plays a queen f3. And here things are not that easy, because there's always that pressure on the pawn on d4, which is not easy to resolve. If you take on c5, that would not be a good idea, because black takes on d1, and after you capture, then black's going to take on b2, and you cannot take the bishop, because then you hang your rook on d1. So instead of all that, Wojtaszek plays bishop a1, preparing to capture on c5. But now Richie comes up with another good move. He goes h5. He wants to put pressure on this side of the board as well. Now taking on c5 is once again not great, because black takes on c5, hitting the queen. If you take the rook, black's going to take here. Takes, check, and you're going to lose your bishop, and with that, the game. So Wojtaszek did not want to let Richie put a lot of pressure here on the king side, so he played queen to d3, trading off the queens. So Richie traded, and he plays h4. Quite a surprising decision, but he wants to ruin white's pawn structure on the king side. So Wojtaszek takes a pawn, and now rook to d5. With the move rook d5, he's preparing to go rook d8, like let's say white goes king g2, now black goes here, and you cannot defend the pawn on d4. And the reason why he went rook d5 and not rook d8 right away is that here white can take the pawn. Right, with the rook on d5, he could always take that rook. Alright, so rook d5 was played, now b4, nice move by Wojtaszek, hitting the pawn. Black cannot take the pawn on b4 or d4 because you hang your rook, so he forced Richie to go c4 and hit the rook on d3. And here it felt like the game was headed for a draw. Rook a3 was played, we saw a trade on d4, takes, white took an a7. And I mean, at this moment, Wojtaszek is even up a pawn. c3, he took the pawn on e7, c2, so it felt like, okay, this game is just going to be a draw, and the match will be decided in the next game. So king of 1 by Wojtaszek, Richie took the pawn. King e2, this might sort of be the start of his problems. During the game, Maria and I thought that rook e2 was the move here, hitting the pawn on c2. Black can go rook b1, but you always have rook e1, and the game should end in a draw, one way or another. But king e2 was played by Wojtaszek. Richie took the pawn on h4, restoring the material balance, rook e3 and rook a4, hitting the pawn on a2, a3 and king g7. But here, the position is not that easy, because white always has these weaknesses over there on the king side, and that makes it difficult to round up the pawn on c2. Also, the white king is always a little bit weak, and black's play is quite easy. He's just going to bring the king up, and one way or another try to go after the pawns on the king side. So king d2 was played by Wojtaszek, rook f4, hitting the pawn on f2, f3 and rook fc4, defending the pawn on c2. Rook b3, and now rook 4 c5. Right, rook 4 c5, a good move by Richie. a4, and now king h6. And this position is very, very tricky for white. Once again, black's play is very easy. Wants to bring the king up to g5, maybe to h4, trying to take this pawn. This pawn is not really going anywhere in the meantime. So Wojtaszek played the move rook a3, putting the rook behind the pawn and preparing to push it up the board. Richie played king to g5, and here maybe he should have played the move a5, just pushing this pawn up the board, but instead of that he played the move rook a2. And this move was actually the decisive, was a very big mistake, because this allowed Richie to play check. Your king has to move to the e file, so the king went to e3, now check. Now let's say you were to go to e2, and after check go to f1. This does not work, because black goes rook d1. And you lose on the spot, because your king is in check, and if you take, black gets a new queen. So you cannot do that. So the king has to move to the second rank. But now comes rook d2 check. We know that the king cannot step back to the first rank, so it had to go to g3. But now rook e2. And all of a sudden, black is threatening checkmate. This king over here is covering both these squares, so white has to push one of these pawns up the board. So Radoslav played f4, king f5. Once again, now black is threatening checkmate on d3 or e3. So he had to play something like king f3, after which the game is still very much going. But instead of that, he played rook to b2, but this allowed a very nasty checkmate for Richard. He played rook d3 check, king h4, and after g5, Wojtaszek resigned. Because if you take this pawn, rook e4 is going to follow, and after king h5, rook takes h3. And your king is checkmated. So quite a dramatic loss for Wojtaszek. This game seemed to be headed for a draw, and now all of a sudden he lost with the white pieces. So that meant that he had to come back with the black pieces. That's always very, very tough, especially if your opponent is just going to play for a draw, and that's exactly what Richard did. Richard traded off all the pieces, made a draw, and qualified to the semifinal against Hikaru, which we will see tomorrow. Anyway, I hope you all enjoyed the video. I look forward to seeing you all in that semifinal when Richard is going to take on Hikaru, and I look forward to seeing you all in the next video.